I've had cases where they do pose the victims. He was looking for the shock value, I guess. That's always been a mystery to me. My name is Pat Postiglione. I was with the Metro Nashville Police Department for 32.5 years. As part of the homicide cold case unit, the unit solved probably in the neighborhood of 75 cold cases. Today we're going to look at serial killer investigations in movies and TV and judge how realistic they really are.
We got blunt force trauma.
What jumps out at me right away in this crime scene is the fact that there's so many people inside the crime scene, and they're all giving their opinions as to what they think it is. They were contaminating the area. They were taking things, you don't realize that you may be stepping on something. You may be stepping on a footprint. So the less people inside the crime scene, the better. What we see here is something that we call bagging the hands, and they do that to preserve evidence. You put a bag over the hand and you seal it. And then when you get the body to the medical examiner's office, they're able to take the bag off and see if any items fell out inside the bag. If not, they're able to scrape the victim's fingernails looking for any sort of trace evidence.
Thumb was severed. Killer may have taken it as a trophy.
He was alive when it was cut off. Ecchymosis around the wound.
So I think what he means is when when the thumb was cut, there was a lot of bleeding. And that typically means the heart is still beating. You can tell if the victim was stabbed numerous times. You can typically tell when the victim died, and some of the stab wounds were after the victim had already died, for example. The serial killers I've been involved in, I had one that did collect a trophy. So it's something that they do. I don't think it's done on a regular basis. I was involved in an investigation on a serial killer where he cut a tattoo off the victim's buttocks, and he took the entire area. We don't know what he did with it. Never found it again. Don't know why he took it other than for a souvenir.
Killer may have come through the skylight. Yeah.
Batman finds a gash in the ground from where the killer dropped his weapon. A lot of times you can look at the injuries on the victim, and sometimes you can make an educated guess as to what the weapon may be. If you find something near the victim like a gouge mark in the floor, that may give you a further idea as to what kind of weapon we're looking for. Is it a blunt instrument? Is it a round instrument? Is it a pointed instrument? That same item, you want to preserve that area. You want to photograph that in great detail. So you have that down the road. If you do find an item, you can match it possibly to that divot in the ground. The scale is just to show the width and the length of the print. They can do an exact measurement at a crime lab. Bruce Mendenhall, serial killer, he left a shoe print next to the victim. When he placed the victim down, we found a shoe print. And no idea who the shoe print belonged to, but when we caught Bruce Mendenhall, I noticed a pair of shoes in the back of his truck, and I looked at them, and the shoe print on the back of the bottom of the shoe was identical. It's not as good as a fingerprint, unless there's some kind of defect in the shoe, some kind of tear or rip that you can match to the crime scene to the actual shoe that's recovered. They do a casting of it, and they lift it, and they take it, and then you have it forever. I would give this a 3.
Star-shaped contact entrance wound over the sternum.
She found a star-shaped wound on the victim, which would typically indicate that it's a close contact wound. The suspect would have been fairly close to the victim. It's not like a distance 5 or 6 feet away. It's more inches away, in some cases a contact wound or close contact wound. Well, typically they'll put that under their nose because the body is in a high state of decomposition, and it's a terrible smell, obviously. We typically didn't do that. We had a way of being able to be in front of a decomposed body, and you breathe through your mouth, and this way you avoid getting the smell of a decomposing body, which is not a good thing.
2 of her fingernails are broken off, and there's dirt or grit under them. It looks like she's tried to claw her way through something.
The dirt under the fingernails typically indicates that the victim fought back, and the obvious hope there would be that we can get some DNA under the victim's fingernails that would identify a killer. Whatever came out of which finger, they'll identify that. They'll send it off in separate bottles, and each one will be examined, so you'll know you got it off for the first finger, you got it off for the thumb, whatever the case may be. And sometimes, actually, you may get the suspect's blood if she was able to scratch the suspect. His blood or her blood may be under her fingernails, so that's what the hope is.
She's got something in her throat.
A calling card could be something like in this case where they leave something to throw off the investigation, possibly throw off the location where the crime may have happened. Calling card could be they do something to the victim, whether it's a particular injury that they do to show that this is not the first one they've done. Sometimes it's they call it a copycat, where they'll do something that they know someone else has done and they do it to try to make it appear as though it's coming from the same suspect when in fact it's a different suspect. The more the killer does at the crime scene, if he or she leaves something behind, we think that's great. We hope they do that every time.
What is the first and principal thing he does? What needs does he serve by killing?
To catch another killer, Clarice consults with serial killer Hannibal Lecter. You don't know how legit the serial killer is going to be. You take the information they give you because they're trying to, in theory, help you catch another serial killer. So I would interview him, and I would interview the heck out of him just for intel, just to get information. And if, my experience has been the serial killers a lot of times are truthful only when it benefits them.
And how do we begin to covet, Clarice? We begin by coveting what we see every day. And don't your eyes seek out the things you want?
Hannibal's analysis, in my opinion, is a little over the top. He may be right on the money, but typically it's not that, I don't think it's that deep in terms of why serial killers kill and why they do what they do. I think it's really not that simple to say, well, he killed because of this reason or that reason, or anger or sexual issues or whatever the case may be. They have no guilt, no fear, no guilt, no remorse. The only regret they have is getting caught. Otherwise, they would have kept on killing. I would rate this a 7. I think the part that pulls it down from a 10 would be the analysis that Hannibal Lecter gave. I don't think that was realistic. I think that was a little over the top. And the reason why you wear gloves is to, in the event you do inadvertently touch something, you're not going to get your print on it or get your DNA on it. You certainly don't want that to happen. Usually you're not going to touch the victim. You have gloves on just as a protection. Booties as well, so you don't bring your shoe print in there. You don't track any outside sources, dirt or whatever inside the crime scene.
No, sir.
Well, usually when we're at the crime scene, we have no idea who the victim is. And we don't really ask if there's any ID on the victim. And the reason is we don't go into the victim's clothing or any other, we don't touch anything. We leave that because we don't know what value that will be. If there's no ID on the victim, what they do is they do fingerprint. And they sometimes, if the victim has a criminal history, will get an ID within an hour. The fact that they didn't really touch the body, they didn't really, other than their, description of the wounds and that kind of thing, I think that was realistic. Usually, if they're going to move the body, they move the body to avoid capture. A lot of times, if the victim is, let's say, lying on their back for an extended period, they'll have what they call lividity, where the blood pools and it's on the back. You can see it. It's a purple color. It's obvious. But then if you find the victim up, and like in this case, in a leaning position, and there's a lividity on the back, you're going to know that the victim had been moved. I was involved in an investigation on a serial killer. He would display his victims in certain ways. One case I had where he lied the victim down on the ground and exposed her body and put her feet together. So he was looking for the shock value, I guess. That's always been a mystery to me. He wanted the grid search, which I think is a great idea. And the grid search is where you mark off certain areas and you search that area. One thing I'd be curious of where the victim was found would be tire tracks coming in, how the victim got there. We wanted to see if there's any tire tracks that we could potentially connect to a suspect, bringing the victim to that area. But the discussion between the two detectives, I think that was realistic. When you're going to get a killer, you typically have your gun out. That's true, but you usually have an army with you. In some cases, you may have a SWAT team with you, depending on what the circumstances are. But you usually don't go there by yourself, unless you may go to this location, looking for a potential witness, and all of a sudden there's a suspect. That may happen too. Well, then you have no control. Then you have to do with whatever you have. When I say clear the house, you want to go inside the house and see if anyone's in there, whether it's a victim or whether it's a suspect. You take out your weapon, your service weapon, and you clear the house. He seemed to be okay, but it's kind of a big job for one person to do, to go in this, look like a fairly big house, to go in there and clear that house on his own. And typically you need backup to make sure the house is cleared thoroughly. I would give this a 9. I think what strikes me as being somewhat accurate is the two detectives standing over the victim, just discussing injuries, maybe what we're looking at. It's difficult to tell. We don't know, so we're kind of throwing information back and forth.
Get up, you sack of
Well, I think when they entered the crime scene, they had the whole team with them, which I think was fairly accurate in the beginning of the scene when they approached that. They didn't know if they had a suspect. They didn't know who was lying on the bed there. If you think the killer's in there with the victim, then the evidence actually becomes secondary because the victim becomes your primary concern. So let's go there with the troops and go on in there with some heavy artillery in the event we can catch the killer before the killer actually kills our victim.
He's alive! He's alive! Emergency on that ambulance!
You want the victim to survive because that victim is a wealth of information, obviously. And if we're dealing with a serial killer, this victim could potentially tell you things about this serial killer that will link him to maybe 10 other homicides, who knows.
Oh, now go! No one touches anything! Oh, man. God.
This picture was dated 3 days ago.
I think it was further accurate when the detective said, no one touches anything. I think what kind of blew that up was when he picked up a whole bunch of photographs and started going through the photographs after he got done saying no one touches anything. He expressed the photographs had, I assume, a timestamp on it that showed 3 days ago. Anything with a date on it, whether it's a real date or whether somebody put that on to try to throw off the investigation, anything like that is useful. I mean, I've been on situations very, very similar to that, where the suspect is there and the suspect has a weapon. The suspect, like in this case, shoots at you, you're going to immediately call for backup. And they didn't do that. Now, you can chase the suspect. I'm with you on that, but at the same time, you want him to hear the sirens, you want him to hear the backup coming for you. That may make him run away, that may make him stop doing what he's doing, but you want that backup en route. The suspect is still in there, then they got all the innocent people out. That's typically what they would do. The bad guy shoots at the police. You don't necessarily want the police shooting back because you don't know who's behind that door. Like in this case, they went inside and there was 3 kids in there. Had they shot through the door, you know, there's a good chance they would have struck somebody totally innocent, uninvolved. Well, sometimes you have to kick in the door, but I can tell you through experience that sometimes the door's not easy to kick in. So they have these little ramrods that they use. They can slam the door open and they go like that and it just bangs it open real quick. There's a deadbolt involved and whatnot. You may not be able to physically kick the door in. You got to know how you're going to get in this door. And the killer's on the other side. You're really exposing yourself to some real dangers. I give this a 5.
Don't move. I want your money and your car keys.
Okay.
The Zodiac killer's been around since the 1970s, killing people periodically and then sending little notes to other people, admitting that he's the one that did that. The scene depicts real Zodiac victims, Brian C. Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. Brian C. Hartnell survived the event and was able to provide key details about his encounter with the Zodiac killer.
Was that thing even loaded?
When we look at these cases, these serial cases, we have to look at 2 different things, whether we're dealing with an organized killer or whether we're dealing with a disorganized killer. With the Zodiac, I think he's more of an organized versus a disorganized. I mean, it seems like he has a plan in place. It's not something that happens spur of the moment. I think that's the key. Most of the serial killers I've dealt with fell into the category of disorganized. When they find their victim, it sometimes happens when they were not maybe expecting it, so they go ahead and take advantage of the situation, victim at the wrong place at the wrong time kind of a deal. The disorganized killer is just that, disorganized. When you get to a crime scene, it's kind of all over the place. There's things strewn about.
I got a single 9mm casing.
That's not going to happen. When he picked up the 9mm shell casing and picked it up and took it away from the victim and took it outside the car. Because you don't want to contaminate. You want to leave it exactly where it was, exactly how it was observed. It's photographed, it's videotaped, and then it's collected by the crime scene investigators, not by the detective. The crime scene is a sacred ground, and you have to preserve everything there. You don't want to touch anything. You don't want to move anything. He looked like a pencil or something in there. I mean, you can use an item similar to that where you can slide it inside the casing to lift it up. This way, nothing is touched on the casing itself, whether, you know, because you're hopeful to get DNA off that casing when the person loaded the weapon. In theory, there's a fingerprint on there, possibly belonging to the suspect. My experience has been they'll typically use a weapon that may not leave a casing. For example, they may use a revolver where there's no casings involved. Other than the picking up the shell casing, I would give it probably an 8. Ted Bundy was a notorious serial killer. He had kidnapped a 12-year-old girl, I believe is what got him eventually caught. Bundy decapitated at least 12 of his victims with a hacksaw. Typically, cutting off the heads or cutting off body parts usually doesn't happen. Normally, when the serial killer kills a victim, they want to get away from that victim as soon as they can, get separated from the victim, whether that means dumping the body in the field, dumping it off the highway. They want to put as much space between them and the victim as they possibly can, as fast as they can. Now, some stay with the body. In Bruce Mendenhall's case, he would keep the body in his truck for a day or two. But in Ted Bundy's case, for him to take the time to do what he did is just inexplicable to me.
The bite mark carnage.
I've testified several times at different trials involving serial killers. It was typical of the prosecution to say what he said in his opening statements, talking about the evidence, talking about the bite marks. You'd walk the jury through the whole scenario, the whole chain of events, and how you were able to, as a detective, figure out this was a guy, whether it's fingerprints, whether it's confessions, whether it's video, whatever it happens to be, DNA, for example. And you explain how you did it with the help of the crime scene investigators, because if it wasn't for the crime scene investigators, a lot of times these cases would never be made. I think I'd give it a 10 because the courtroom scene was accurate, and the prosecutor laid out his case very well, too.
He's learned. No more fibers.
This case was based on the Atlanta child murders, and there was evidence in terms of trace evidence. There was carpet fibers found on some of the victims that linked back to him. And let's say we find a crime scene, we have a homicide victim, and we find some fibers on this victim that later down the road we're able to link those fibers to that sweater that we took out of the killer's closet, for example. That would be one way of linking him to fibers.
14 bridges.
Set up scouts under the bridges on either side. Constant surveillance from sundown to sunrise.
We had a serial killer that was killing people at fast food restaurants. And he was using Captain D's, for example. He was robbing Captain D's and killing the people, killing everybody. So we staked out all the Captain D's in the area, and we were hopeful that he would try to hit while we were obviously staked out. And we did that, hoping he would hit. And in this case, they're doing the exact same thing. They're staking out the rivers, hoping he would dump his next victim. It sounds like they had a lot to stake out. I don't know if they had the manpower to do it, but you may stake out this area tonight, that area tomorrow night, but it has to be a process that you can't quit on. A lot of it's guesswork, but it's educated guesses usually.
The only way I could have those girls was to kill them, and it worked.
Mindhunter is a book where real FBI agents profile serial killers. One of the real killers profiled is Ed Kemper, who was portrayed here. Kemper was responsible for at least 8 deaths. A killer like Kemper would not be handled like that. There'd be guards there with him. There's no way he'd be able to move freely like that. Absolutely impossible. And he would not be chained to the bed. There's no way he'd be able to get out of the bed and walk around as freely as he was doing in this clip. I would give it a 7. The scene where the Kemper is being interviewed is not really accurate. I think the first clip would be probably a 10, when they were actually on the river.
2 plastic bags in the freezer, each containing a human heart.
Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer. In some cases, he would keep the bodies, he would behead them, he would keep body parts inside of his refrigerator, and apparently had been, at some point, possibly even eating some of his victims, and really just beyond the imagination could even think of, he was involved in. It appears to be an accurate depiction of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes and also how they approached the crime scene. They were doing the same thing. They were in a suspect's apartment, but at the same time, it was also the killing field where he was killing a lot of his victims. So it was kind of a twofold thing. The suspect lived here. He also did some of his killings here.
In the bedroom, there was 5 more skulls.
When you find just bones, it's a little more difficult. You hope to find some kind of markings on the bones that'll indicate a gunshot wound, indicate a strike mark, a stab wound, or anything along those lines. It's more difficult when you find just bones, but when you find bones in someone's refrigerator or a bunch of bones inside of a vat full of some sort of a chemical, you can rest assured that that victim was murdered. And sometimes they could put it together where they can help tell you we're dealing with a female, we're dealing with a male. A lot of times they can tell the sex of the victim. A lot of times they can tell the age of the victim by the bones. I would rate this clip a 10. It looks like something that we would have done pretty much the same way they were doing it, in detail, great detail. Normally when you're in a low light environment like this one was, you would bring in more lights. You don't want to miss a single thing. Big spotlights, and they would make the place look like daylight.
Remember, crime scenes are three-dimensional. Floors, walls, and ceilings.
That's very accurate because we've had cases where the victim is killed, for example, here, and we have cast-off blood on the ceiling. You can tell by the cast-off, by the direction of the cast-off on the ceiling or on the wall, whether the victim was hit with a left hand or with a right hand. A lot of people don't realize that, but if you're hitting someone with a left hand, their blood is going to come on the ceiling and make an arc a certain way. So you're going to be able to look at the ceiling and say you're dealing with a left-handed person. Typically, the tape lifting will be done on the crime scene. Well, tape lifting is taking a piece of tape and lifting an item, whatever it is, fingerprint or whatever the item is. In this case, I think it was a hair. And you would put it on the tape, and you would lift it off the tape, and then you'd preserve that tape. You'd put it in a jar, and you'd preserve it. Down the road, DNA analysis, match it to somebody else potentially, or maybe even help identify the victim, or whatever the case may be. You want to keep that hair separate. You photograph it the way it is, but you're going to know that at one point they were together.
I want you to saw her hands off at the wrist line. We gotta have those cuffs for prints.
The collecting of the handcuffs by cutting off the hands would probably not happen. Sometimes you may have to cut the cuffs off for fingerprints or potential DNA on there, not belonging to the victim, but belonging to the suspect. You would typically take the body from the scene and take the body to the medical examiner's office where it's a sanitized area, plenty of light, and plenty of time to do what you need to do versus doing it in the mud. Well, we've had situations where we've had the victim with rope around the neck, for example, and we would have to take that, and we want to preserve the knot. So you don't undo the knot. You cut the rope off in the back of the neck, and you take it off. So now we got the knot preserved in the event something else happens, and we have a similar knot. Same thing with handcuffs. If you don't have a key, there's no way to unlock the handcuffs. They would probably just cut the handcuffs off and then go through the process to analyze the handcuffs. We're looking for DNA, we're looking for fingerprints, we're looking for anything that might belong to the suspect. I would rate this around a 6. I think my favorite scene that I watched today was from True Detective, when they were going after the bad guy, when they went into the house to try to clear the house. Their discussions, their interaction when they found the body. If you like this video, why not click on the next one?